You are listening to the Airline Selection Podcast, where we bring you insights to help you succeed at airline selections. This podcast is brought to you by Airline Selection Program. Please welcome your host, airline captain and major airline recruiter, Guillaume Debauchez.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Airline Selection Podcast, where we give you tips and insights to help you succeed at your airline selection. And today, part of our Calvin Speaks series, we have Calvin Shields with us. How are you doing, Calvin, today?
Great, thanks, Guillaume. Great.
Excellent. So last time we hinted a little bit at what we're going to talk about today. Can you just remind us, Calvin?
Yes, I thought we'd start off by talking about base training and then maybe touch on a bit of CRM towards the end.
Yes, and we'll talk about the coffee cup story that's in your book. Can you remind us what your book is called, Calvin?
Yeah, it's actually called, strangely, I have a copy here. I'm not sure I can show it on the screen. Yeah, let's see whether that will make sense. That's the actual book itself.
Yes.
It's called Dancing the Skies and Falling with Style.
Excellent.
It's an honest discussion of my life as an airline pilot.
Yeah, it's a fantastic read. It's very well written, actually. And I myself like to write. I've tried myself at a novel, which I never finished, but I like to write short stories in French, actually. And when I read your book, not only spoke to me a lot because, you know, we're both at British Airways. And just to remind everybody, Calvin left British Airways in 2003. I joined in 2005. But so we still have a very common reference in terms of a cultural reference, at least from belonging to this airline together. So for me, it was fantastic to read this book. And a big reason why we're having this podcast today is because I related so much to the stories that you told and also of the times past. You know, your career is fantastic and the way you write about it. And it's not just about flying, it's also about the life alongside it, how you grew up and all that. And the way England was before with the colonies and all of that, and the evolution of British Airways from BOAC, BA to what it became later. It's just a fantastic read. So you can find details of the book in the show notes, by the way. And so now let's get into it and talk about your base training, right?
Again, as we said previously, that before zero flight time simulators, it was necessary to actually learn to fly the aeroplane itself. When I left the VC-10 in 1975, I spent a few days in Prestwick on the 747-100 series learning how to fly it. And I must admit, looking back on it, it was quite interesting because, for example, we would do simulated engine failures by throttling back engines. We would do some pretty extreme stuff that you probably wouldn't do today. But you've also got to remember that this is pre-GPWS, pre-data recorders and so on to a certain extent. So a lot of things were done which you probably couldn't get away with today. I mean, for example, my training captain, who was a wonderful guy, we had to simulate an incapacitation, and we can talk a lot about this.
Oh, yeah.
And his incapacitation was at about 400 feet after takeoff. He collapsed over the controls and he pushed nearly full left rudder at 400 feet. And believe me, I've never forgotten that because we were, we were up at 50, 60 degrees bank, and I'm trying to control it by pushing opposite rudder and so on. And it was a pretty dangerous maneuver.
At 400 feet on the 400 plane.
Feet. Absolutely 400 feet.
Wow.
I could tell you the name of this instructor because I've never forgotten it, but I won't. It was quite extraordinary. But of course, he would, because he was, how can I say, he was a very good pilot in terms of he could handle the airplane extremely well. We'd do some pretty interesting maneuvers in the airplane for real. And what it did do is it made me realize how good an airplane it was, how wonderful an airplane it was, how forgiving it was as well at the same time.
When you said that you did simulated engine failures, were they just at cruise altitude or fairly high, or did you actually do them close to the ground as well?
We would do them just out of V1. And before V1, we do rejected takeoffs as well. Lightweight, very lightweight.
Oh,
just
wow.
after V1.
Okay, after that, the airplane was fried, right? Could you take it off again?
We were very lightweight. We were always very lightweight, of course, for zero flight training. And it would probably do the rejected takeoff at the end of the day. But you didn't need much cooling time, even though they were steel brakes on the 100 series rather than the carbon brakes, which were added to the 200, which were much, much more efficient. But no, we used to do them after V1 regularly. It was nearly always an outboard engine, of course, a 4-engine aeroplane with maximum swing and so on. But I mentioned in the last episode that there was a 707 accident on base training in BA. It was actually in 1977 when BA had transferred the remaining 707s to British Air Tours. We did all of our base training in those days at Prestwick up in Scotland, and they were doing the same sort of thing, exactly what I've just discussed. And the captain closed the thrust lever of number 1 engine just after V1. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to find out the exact details, but I do know that they put left rudder trim in, which of course is completely opposite to what you want to do. The aeroplane got to about 20 or 30 feet above the ground, and they lost control of the aeroplane, and they hit the ground. Basically, the aeroplane was destroyed. All 4 engines were ripped off. The undercarriage was ripped off, but they managed to escape. There were 4 crew on board. But one of the interesting things was that they were covered in kerosene after the incident, and they were in hospital for a while because a lot of people aren't quite aware how corrosive kerosene is. So when you're doing your walk around your aeroplanes in the future, be very careful about getting any kerosene on you. It is not nice.
That and the hydraulic fluid as well. If you get the hydraulic fluid is clear, and if it gets into your eye, it can be very, very bad. So when you look at your landing gear or anything, if there's anything dripping, don't go under it. Maybe you can try and collect it to see if it's oily or what it is, but not in your eyes. It's very dangerous.
Absolutely right. And again, this is something I would do, because part of your training will be to do an external check with a training captain, and he'll take you around the aeroplane. And one of the things I always stress was do not look up in the undercarriage bay, because don't forget the hydraulics run at very high pressures, normally about 3,000 psi. That means there's a lot of strain on the joints of the pipes. And of all the failures I had in my career, the most were hydraulic failures of pipes coming apart effectively. And there's always a little bit of hydraulic fluid around in the undercarriage bay particularly, and it amuses me that you say that, because that's absolutely true. Don't look up. If you see something dripping on the aeroplane, and where I would always look was on the tires, on the top of the tires. You quite often see a little bit of, and I would put my finger on it and I would try and decide whether it was hydraulic or water or something else. So part of your responsibilities walking around the aeroplane are to check this sort of thing. Do we have a leak? So yes, the hydraulic fluid also, of course, is very corrosive. You get it in your eye, you've got a big problem. On most aircrafts, the big airplanes, all of the ones that I flew, there would have been a hydraulic oil eye flush kit in the medical kit on the aeroplane, so that if you did have a problem, hopefully you'd be able to flush it out. But after that event with the 707, all future engine failures could only be conducted in the simulator.
It's an interesting one with this, because a lot of people will have applied wrong rudder during their training at some point. So there's no shame. You can be a great pilot and have done that once early in training. The tip on that really is to try and figure out where the airplane is going and to boot in the other direction. If you start to figure, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you're the examiner here and the instructor, but I'm a bit an instructor, but compared to you, it's not the same. But so the way I've done it as a line pilot, at least, or having been through the sim quite a lot myself, is if you figure out where the plane's moving, then you apply opposite rudder and things, you tend to boot in the right direction. If the big mistake is if people trying to figure out, it's this engine that's gone, and then they make a mini calculation in their head to figure out which rudder they should apply. And that's when things go wrong, because they don't do it with their body, they do it with their head. And that's why now we don't say anymore, say that you have an engine failure at V1, the first pilot who notices it will normally be the monitoring pilot, and he's supposed to say now engine failure or engine fire. He's not supposed to say engine 1 failure or engine 1 fire, because a catastrophic situation like the 707 could happen just for that reason.
Yeah, I agree completely, Guillaume. The thing is, you don't want to look in if you have an
No.
engine failure. You want to be looking out. If you're on the runway, it's a little bit more difficult if the engine failure happens just after you've rotated and you don't have a horizon. But the biggest tip I could give to anybody who has an engine failure after a V1 is to look at the runway, far end of the runway,
Yes.
and use rudder to keep the nose going straight down the runway. And then keep your feet there at rotate. Do not move them. Hold them there. You may have a slight adjustment if you have rather fine steering, which is helping you on the center line. You might have to put a little bit more rudder as you rotate, but hold it and then fine tune it as you climb away. In the simulators, so many times I would see people looking down with an engine failure and then they'd just mess it up. The other thing I'd really like to say is that in the simulator, in the event of a failure, I would always let students make that error. If they're making a mistake, I let them make the errors, because if you do that, you own the error, you never forget it. If I say to you, if you do that, you're going to come off the runway, you'll probably not remember it. But if you actually do come off the runway in the simulator, then you will never forget that.
That's interesting, because when we were instructing MCC, in my early MCC instructing days, you gave me some advice about what could lead to negative training. So, and I liked the advice that you gave me, because, you don't want to put a student into a situation that is too difficult for them to deal with because of the negative training that it brings. But so here you let it happen, and I'm pretty sure you've got a good reason for it. And you probably, I guess you're setting a line where it starts to get into negative training. So where do you put the line?
Okay, a really good example would be, let's say, on the airplane for real, and I can remember quite clearly in Singapore Airlines on one occasion flying to Houston on it wasn't a particularly difficult approach. The weather was fine, a bit bumpy, and the first officer was flying it, very inexperienced first officer. Now, I had my own limits, that if the airplane, he wasn't on the center line effectively, and this is probably the best way to explain it. And I have my own limits that if he doesn't touch down between the center line and the edge light, then I'm going to do something about it. And so I did say to him, okay, we're slightly right. If I'd taken over control at that particular point and put it on the center line, this is before touchdown at, say, 200 feet, I don't think he would have ever remembered it. But we did land halfway between the center line and the runway edge light. It's a very wide runway, don't forget. And I know for sure that the 747 can do that. And I don't think he ever forgot that. In the simulator, if they put a bit of left rudder in, what I'm saying is an incorrect rudder, I should say, in this particular case, what I'm saying is you don't let them crash, but you let them go a bit further. You get a bit of bank on and you realize that they've done the wrong thing. If you tell them immediately, right rudder, right rudder, right rudder, then I don't think that they'll remember that. I think you've got to experience it to really remember it.
Yeah, so you see how this fine line when you're instructing about setting the right thing so that the training is a learning experience you can build on, instead of being something that you feel so deeply ashamed of that your confidence gets dented and you can't learn from it. Or if the instructors put you in a tunnel just to see if you could recover, that would be negative training. But as an instructor, it's quite easy to sort of, you see you have good students and you want to push them and push them and push them to try and get them into more and more, and then come a point you go too far, and that could lead into negative training. And that's the beauty of instructing, is to put yourself at the level where you can teach in the best way and bring the most to a student, whilst having them build on their confidence, right?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that from my point of view, I always believe that training should be, I was going to say fun. It doesn't have to be fun, but certainly not punitive in any shape or form.
Yeah.
The moment that it's punitive, you completely lost your students. So I encourage a good relationship with my students when I'm training, and I think I get the best out of them in the end. There is no room for any sort of bullying or any sort of I am better than you sort of atmosphere on training, as far as I'm concerned. And generally throughout my career, I've had pretty good results, I must say.
And I think that's true at an instructor's level, but also at an organizational level. And if you've watched one of the YouTube videos that I've posted in April 2024, sorry, in May 2024, you will see that there's one where I talk about the last airline where I was at, where there was a bit of fear, not inside the sim itself, the sim sessions, but more from an organizational point of view, this sort of fear and pressure is difficult to live with. Let's put it this way: for a pilot, it's kind of tough to live in this feeling of impending doom. You see some colleagues being treated very harshly, as a sim that doesn't go well, and they get into this sort of scrutiny that seems too much, and they lose their confidence gradually, and you just see them deteriorate. This is very, from that perspective, the training organization failed in a way. Okay.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I always said that I could have failed Neil Armstrong, and I could have failed anybody in a 747 if I really wanted to. But what does that achieve? It achieves absolutely nothing. What was good from my point of view when I ended up in Singapore Airlines as training management, of course, I was the one that set the standards anyway. So, if anyone was going to get in trouble, I had to tell myself off, if you like. So I tried to engender a much less punitive atmosphere in Singapore Airlines cargo, which I really believe I achieved just before I retired or left Singapore Airlines. It was a great feeling to see these young co-pilots actually enjoying themselves in the simulator to a certain extent and being much less under threat the whole time. They were much, how can I say, they communicated much, much more effectively, I believe, by the end of my tenure as a trainer in Singapore Airlines, management trainer.
Excellent. Well, yeah, I can see why. So that's great. Thank you so much. So I think we maybe will have another podcast about engine failures, because we could talk about that at length, because there are so many implications that you can discuss around those. And the engine failure after takeoff, the EFATO, as we call it, is the gold standard of failure, so to say, that we all rehearse, and around which all of the sort of decision model is built around that, which actually leads to the fact that the decision models don't always work perfectly, because all failures are not an engine failure after takeoff. They happen at different times. So that's another topic we could discuss. But it's a failure that of course all of us will be subject to in the sim a lot, and there's a lot to talk about. So maybe we'll do that in a different episode. So we wanted to talk about CRM and the coffee cup. So I'll let you talk a little bit about what you wanted to discuss about CRM today, because we can't cover the whole CRM in a podcast like this. It's going to take incremental, discussions between us to cover some of it. But so what are we going to discuss today?
Well, CRM, of course, is absolutely crucial to safe aircraft operation, but it didn't really start until the early 1970s. I think we discussed earlier that it was the French Air Force and maybe the Royal Air Force came to realize that there was a lot of accidents being caused through crew communicational problems, rather than through technical failures of the aircraft. And the CRM courses were generally or slowly introduced to the airlines. And in 1974, when BA actually was formed by the merger of BOAC and BEA, was effectively when CRM was introduced to British Airways. But of course, the bit that amused me most of all is that the people who said that they didn't need the course were, of course, those who really did, like these very old, they weren't very old, but for me they were old, these very experienced, older ex-wartime captains who were all one-man bands, and they're the ones who needed it most of all. And of course, they didn't, in fact, it wasn't compulsory, and some of them just didn't turn up.
So 1974, you say? I would have thought CRM training came in the 90s. and
Oh, no.
Wow, okay.
No. Yeah, no, it was well before then. I think it was also brought about because there were a lot of accidents in the USA caused by pilot error. And it became apparent that it was more to do with the communications and team skills that were causing these accidents. Now I know definitely in the mid-70s. I'll look it up, and I'm sure it was 74 in BA. I'd be very surprised if it wasn't.
But I know for sure that it took time to come in, because I remember when I started flying, you couldn't smoke on the flight deck anymore. But some of my captains told me that just 10 years back, so in the 90s, it was still happening. And they told me, well, I flew with this captain, he was smoking his big pipe. And I told him, well, I'm not comfortable with you smoking because it hurts my eyes. And the captain said, well, in that case, you can just leave the flight deck,
Well, that's... I have to very quickly tell you a story about that, Guillaume, because it really amuses me. Very early on the 74, so it was probably 77, 78. I was flying with a captain who smoked little cheroots. These little small, horrible, and I've never smoked. I hate smoking.
A cheroot? What is that?
A cheroot is a tiny little cigar, cigar. cigarillo. No, it was a cigar, a horrible, horrible smell. And we were going to Barbados, taking off on 09 right at Heathrow, which was a very long way from Terminal 3 at the time. A very hot day, and this was before takeoff slots were introduced, and we're about number 20 for takeoff.
Oh.
And we were in line. We'd taken an extra 2 tons of fuel for taxi. I do remember that. And he's smoking away, smoking his little cigar. And the whole flight deck was completely full of smoke. And I was coughing, pretending. He just completely ignored me. And so I thought, right, I've had enough of this. And I reached down and I pulled up my oxygen mask and I put my oxygen mask on and turned the mic on. And I'm sounding like Darth Vader in Star Wars. And we took off with me wearing my oxygen mask, and he'd stopped smoking at this point. And as we changed, I think, from tower to the departure frequency, London said something like, "Oh, have you got a problem?" Because he could tell I was on my oxygen mask. And you know, that you made me smile when you talked about that, because for me that was the worst thing about flying in the 70s and 80s was the smoking on the aeroplane.
Yeah, I mean, it could create it. It still today it causes CRM issues when you are at a coffee shop, at the coffee terrace today. You know, people argue about this today still. But imagine now you're confined, you know, within a cockpit, and it's terrible. I mean, personally I would have struggled. And actually, I remember the very, very first flight that I did it was in a Fokker 100. I was invited. I was going to do this typewriting, which was my first typewriting. I was invited by someone to attend a flight, and the co-pilot was smoking. I remember it's the only time that this ever happens. It was a small airline, so and I remember telling the captain, who was the friend, said, "You don't say anything. It's disgusting." And it's like, I'd rather have him smoke and be nice and relaxed than argue with him and degrade the CRM. And I remember this. I went like, "Oh my God, you know, it's interesting, but I hope that my next airline, you know, just forbids that." And I've heard today some of my students told me who now some of our students they're now at the airline. Some guys, some captains smoke electronic cigarettes on board.
Yes, it happened to me in Singapore Airlines. I was doing a line check across the Pacific, actually, on a crew. And I was taking a bit of a break in the upper deck. It's on a freighter, of course, in one of the seats at the upper deck. And the captain who I was doing the line check on, and it was completely forbidden in Singapore Airlines to smoke on the airplane at all. He came back and he was smoking a cigarette in front of me. And that was just, well, he failed, of course. So simple as that.
Yeah, it's interesting. This little thing. So the cigarette would damage the CRM if both of you weren't in agreement. I remember my very first flight at BA, which under instruction, I had a senior instructor who's a nice guy, very knowledgeable guy. And at the end of the flight, he told me, and I did a good landing. I remember it was on a 321, which was a bit tougher, and in some respects. And he said, "Oh yeah, your handling's very good. There's one thing I'd say about your CRM." I was like, "What's that?" He said, "Well, you remember when they came in for a choice of sandwiches? You just took one. You didn't ask me which one I wanted." And I took it quite seriously. I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize, because, you know, we were so busy. They came in quick and gave, and I just grabbed the first one I saw, basically." And we're like, yeah, there's more to it than all the theory about CRM. It's also about the fine things, you know, to just be as nice as you can to the other one, you know. And wow, that was a learning experience for me on my very first flight.
But also you also have to consider cultural differences as well. Don't forget, if you're flying with an airline, Singapore Airlines theoretically had 44 different nationalities on the aeroplane, and of course cultural things that you have to understand, the cultural differences.
Oh, definitely. And I remember when I started flying for BA, and I'm French, you know, and I got to understand this much more when I started to study personalities and cultural differences as part of that, as part of my job as a recruiter. But in France, we shake hands quite a lot when we meet, when we say goodbye on the first day, and every subsequent day we shake hands, and sometimes we can shake hands twice within the same day. In the UK, it's a bit different. You would shake hands the first time you meet, but it may happen a bit less, so to say. You know, the next day at the hotel, you typically wouldn't. correct me if I'm wrong, but most people wouldn't the next day. You'd met already, and so that's fine. And so none of this is badly intended. In England, my view was people were very polite, and you can see it when you drive. They're much more polite than in France, for instance. There's cultural differences. But one thing that struck me, and I know that it wouldn't work at Air France, for having asked my friends, is when the engineer would come on the flight deck. You were busy preparing your FMS. The captain was gone doing his walk around or somewhere in the cabin. The engineer would come into our space, typically, and sit on the jump seat, grab the tech log, not even saying hello. That you would do this on an Air France plane, I'm pretty sure the guy would get kicked out of the flight deck and a replacement will be requested. That's a cultural difference right there, because this engineer that came on the flight deck didn't mean bad. He just came to do his job, not wanting to disturb you. In fact, it's polite. But with my cultural filter, I went like, what a rude guy. He just sat here and didn't even say hi.
Yeah, you're right though, Guillaume, of course, because certainly in the UK, the engineers and the cabin crew are told not to disturb you and wait until you talk to them first, because you might be doing something important. So, I think that was the issue with that. An interesting one, of course, very interesting indeed.
Yes, because as you travel and as you do long haul, so already when you do short haul, you meet engineers from all over the world. But now you're in China, or you're somewhere in Asia, or you're in Africa, and everybody, you need to apply that filter in order to, and in India, it's very, very interesting as well, working with them. We could do a full podcast just on that, actually.
I thought that I might finish this particular episode by, as we're discussing the beginnings of CRM, to illustrate a little example, and maybe we could discuss the coffee cup. Maybe we could discuss the we have an English word, ramifications, the results of the actual action in a later episode. But yes, the episode because of course it's in my book. But it's a great little story about CRM, because we're going back to when we used to navigate on the VC-10. One of my close friends was navigating on a trip. Now, it was the plum trip, the best trip. We would fly from London, have to navigate to New York, and then we'd fly by VORs from New York to Los Angeles. Each place, of course, we'd get off and have a couple of days off. And then there was a navigation sector from Los Angeles to Honolulu, Honolulu to Fiji, and then Fiji all the way down to Melbourne, where you'd have a few days off, and then you'd go back the same way. And so it was not far off a 3-week-long trip.
3 weeks? Oh my God.
Yeah, with the same crew. And a lot of navigation on it, of course. And in those days, as I mentioned earlier, there were 2 young co-pilots who swapped the navigation. Anyway, my friend was navigating, I think, between Fiji and Honolulu on the way back. So they'd already been together for 10 days, and the captain had not said one word to my friend. He would only address, my friend was the second officer, and the first officer was a bit older than him. The captain would only address the second officer through the first officer. He would say, in my case, he would say, tell Mr. Shields to get his hair cut, something like that, if you see what I mean. So it was that sort of communication was indirect through the first officer. He was also very aggressive, and my friend was quite a strong character, but he was a bit upset by this, the fact that he hadn't been spoken to. So what the captains used to do was that they would get out of their seat at 5,000 feet, and they'd go sit in first class, and they would stay there and go to sleep or whatever, and they'd only come back and land the aeroplane, get in at 5,000 feet on the approach and land the aeroplane. We're very happy with that, because as soon as the captain left the flight deck, the atmosphere could relax.
Wow.
And that was the case with my friend. So he was navigating between, as I say, Fiji and Honolulu, and the navigator's desk was really quite big, and it faced aft. And it was just to the left of the aeroplane. So the gangway or the entrance to the cabin was to the left of his table, if you like, because it was facing backwards. So he got out of his seat. He went into first class, as he always did, and he put his coffee cup down on the navigator's table, went into the first class. And there was one seat, but it was broken. It was fully reclined, and he was in a foul mood that he had to come back on the flight deck. And he's sitting there and really sulking in his seat. Now, the way we navigated was that we do a fix every 20 minutes, which was shooting 3 stars. I think we'll talk about navigation in another podcast. So every 20 minutes, he would put basically you gave the captain a course correction card. It was an official piece of paper, and it was called a course correction card. You put a heading on it, and he passed over the heading. Normally it was 5 degrees or 10 degrees or something like that. And my friend, he passed over a course correction of 45 degrees. And bearing in mind, my friend was 20, 21, 22, 23, and nobody else knew where they were because there were no navigation aids at all. And the captain looked round and thought, what the heck's going on here? 45 degrees, he probably didn't believe him and put in 30 degrees or something like that. Anyway, another 20 minutes later, he was presented with another very large course correction. At this point, the captain's getting a bit worried. So we're now going 40 minutes because every 20-minute fixes. And so eventually, after the third big change of course, he actually turned round and he said to my friend, he said, boy, he said, do you know where the bloody hell, where are we going all over the sky, for goodness sake? What's this, 25, 45 degrees, 35? What the hell is going on? And he said, well, sir, he said, look, you haven't spoken to me for the last 10 days. And to be honest, I'm a little sort of frightened of you. And you put your cup on my chart right in the middle of track. I didn't dare move it, so I navigated around it. And he went 200 miles off track to go round the captain's coffee cup on his chart.
So what happened then? Yes. How did the flight conclude?
Well, he said nothing. He just ignored it, and they carried on, and he didn't speak again to my friend at all until they got back to London another week later.
But the incident was reported. So 200 miles, just to give everybody perspective, 200 miles is quite a lot. But it can happen that you have to divert. I mean, 200 miles is a lot, but it could happen that you divert a good 100 miles around a large area of cloud. That could happen, but it's a very big diversion. Yeah, it would cost you what? It would cost you a good 20 minutes, 20.
Oh yes, yeah.
Even more.
Well,
Yeah.
in those days, the captain would have to fill in the trip report, and so no mention was made that I'm aware of. Of course, the story filtered down to us because we knew the captain. None of us liked him, and we were quite amused by it. But of course, it does have safety implications. CRMs. Sure. I think we will have to discuss this in a later, perhaps next episode, because it's a good discussion point.
But so what happened? Because I from remembering from the book, this got reported to the office.
No, not that I'm aware of. No, it wasn't reported to the office. It probably was reported indirectly through word of mouth.
Because I thought your friend got told off for doing that.
No.
No.
There was no official report made.
Right. But so from a CRM perspective, just looking at it from a CRM perspective, what's interesting to me here is that, of course, the main contributing factor here is the atmosphere that was set by the captain throughout. You're not talking to one of the people that you share a small room with effectively for 10 days is from a CRM perspective. I mean, the base of CRM lies around, communication. I mean, there's many aspects to CRM, but communicating effectively is one way that you could take a look at it synthetically. This is failed right from the beginning. When you speak through another person, already right there, you can have, Chinese whispers right there and words being miscommunicated. But if you're in the same room, it's just plain rude. It's tough, so your friend was probably on edge. And then another contributing factor is that, your friend from the outside, we weren't here, but it seems that he also didn't display very good CRM by kind of overreacting on this, right?
Yeah, I agree, but you have to realize that these captains were absolutely unapproachable. And he's 22, the captain's probably 53, war hero. He doesn't listen to anybody. He's only communicating through the first officer to my friend. There was no communication chain whatsoever. I suppose, perhaps thinking about it, he could have said to the first officer, could you tell the captain
That's right.
that he needs to move his coffee cup? And of course, he didn't do that. So, but this was pre-CRM, and I think this is a classic example of where CRM was required, very much so.
Yes, and when we were preparing for this episode, we were talking about CRM, which is a topic that's very dear to the both of us. And my view of it is that if there's one thing that doesn't belong on the flight deck, it's your ego. Leave that behind the door. Even better, leave it in the car park before you enter the airline. Nothing will cause safety issues more than that ego. And that's something myself I try to say during my briefings, because I heard some captains say it and I found it quite effective when I was a first officer. There is no ego here. You can tell me anything. Please feel comfortable doing so. enjoy your flying, fly it the way you like. Let me know if you do something unusual so I can assist you, so I can know in advance and I'm not surprised. And let's leave our egos outside the door and have a safe flight. And I think when you work like this, it's so much more effective, right? Because you know how it is with the ego. You can get a hamster in your head and just tunnel on what this other person's told you and take it badly and get into all sorts of insane thoughts. We're all subject to it as humans at one point or another of our lives. We don't want to bring this at work on a plane. As much as we can avoid it, we should, I think.
Absolutely well said. I agree with that 100%. I like that briefing that the captain told you. I think that's perfect.
Great. Well, I think we are going to leave it here for now. What do you know already what we're going to talk about next time?
Well, I think we're talking about basically a long haul, the lifestyle, how it was in long haul in the 70s. Perhaps that's quite a big subject, and particularly the life of an airline pilot, how it will affect your viewers in the future.
But tell me, in those days when you were going to in New York, Los Angeles, Honolulu, Fiji, how old were the cabin crew on average?
Well, put it this way, there was a minimum age for cabin crew of 21. I started off at 19, just 20, so I was quite often the youngest. Normally, having said that, the stewardesses would normally leave. I'm not sure they had to leave, but they would normally leave around about 30. Or if they were married, I believe they weren't allowed to be stewardesses either for some reason. I don't know why. But they'd normally leave by about. So the stewardesses were between 21 and 30, but the stewards were, a lot of them came from the ships that used to cross the Atlantic. And when the ships started to be less frequent in operation, they joined the airlines. So they would be older. They could be up to the same age as the captains. So yeah, I was, for a year or so, I was the youngest person on the whole aeroplane. And by the way, in New York, I was old enough to fly an aeroplane across the Atlantic, but I wasn't old enough to have a beer in the bar.
So you would go on a 3-week trip with unmarried cabin crew who were between 21 and 35, basically. That's the tone for the next episode, so to say. And at Air France as well, it's the same. That when they got married, the stewardesses would lose their jobs, which there was a very big dispute on that, because how fair was that on them? I mean, it took them a long while to gain that. It was a significant victory for them. Very good. So we'll see you in the next episode. Calvin, it was a pleasure to have you on board once again. And once again, we bring you here tips and advice so you can have a feeling for what it is. What do we talk about in between captains, even captains of different generations, when we relate over our careers. And we hope that this helps you project yourself in your future role, which of course will have a very big impact during your airline selection if you can explain all these concepts in an elaborate way. For this, of course, advanced interview course and all the solutions that we have for you are always available. You can find them in the show notes, in the description. And of course, don't forget to pick up a copy of Calvin's book, which again, we'll link in the show notes. See you in the next episode.
This podcast was brought to you by Airline Selection Program, a company that is focused on helping you succeed at airline selections. Our flagship course, Advanced Interview Course, has helped hundreds of pilots just like you become successful. Visit our website at online.airlineselectionprogram.com and find out how you too can get the job of your dreams.